Well, I thank everybody for the warm welcome, and yes, it's me, morning team. It's your favourite, Jordan at the screen, as my intro usually is, and I started off blogging on my site, The Screen, and from that sort of springboarded into wider research towards my number one area, which is the human-gender empathy gap, which has a very long, colourful and fascinating history, which I will slightly touch on, but I really just want to go into some of the science behind it and how much it actually impacts our day-to-day lives. Oh, hang on. So, what is the impact of sex of stimulus in empathic responsiveness, aside from being a really long tongue twister? It underpins everything. It is everywhere. Everything that has brought us here today as MRAs, as equality advocates, as whatever we may call ourselves. All of it's happened, as far as I'm concerned, because of the empathy gap. Without the empathy gap, I don't think that the enemy would have been anywhere near as successful. It's why they were able to convince us of this elusive patriarchy without being called tinfoil hat conspiracy theorists. It's why men are told to man up and take it on the chin whenever they face any form of strife or struggle, say nationally sanctioned genital mutilation. Men are essentially told to get over it, that's your job, whereas the slightest of infraction, any minor offence against a woman, is to be considered of national importance, such that a very prominent MP managed to lose his job because he put his hand on a woman's knee and made a pass one time 15 years ago. Something that is really just minor flirting cost a guy his job. And so there's many names for the impact of sexual stimulus in empathic responsiveness. The human gender empathy gap, as most of us know it as, which dictates that we exhibit different levels of empathy for men and for women. Then there's gynocentrism, the fact that we focus and centre our efforts and energies on women. The pussy pass, anyone who follows my blog will be acutely aware of it, in that I run the Women Who Should Be in Prison series. How yes, it's my most successful piece. That one blew up much faster than I thought it would, getting lots of interesting comments in The Guardian and BuzzFeed and other such places. And I essentially remark on how women receive considerably more lenient sentences than men do for the same crime, that is, in the rare occasion they actually receive a sentence. Then there's male disposability, the idea that men are utilities and can be discarded at will. Essentially, they are old rags. Once you've served your purpose, you are tossed. At the bottom of the rabbit hole shows us how the problem is at least 1 billion years old, originating at the dawn of anisogamy sex itself, such that the protection function of males operates even at the genetic level. And the last one exposes the three-dimensional nature of the empathy gap, the importance of sexual stimulus in sex differences in empathic responsiveness. Try saying that one 10 times when you've had a couple of pints. So the three dimensions of this, the first one is the levels of empathy exhibited by both men and women. We know that women are more empathic than men are. Then there's the actual empathy gap itself, the split between men and women. And then there's sex differences in the empathy gap, how as men and as women, the empathy gaps that we feel towards men and women themselves also differ. And dimensions 2 and 3 are those that interest me at the moment. Why is it we exhibit different levels of empathy to men and to women? So, studies that show the empathy gap in action. I'm just going to quickly blast my way through these. So there's Bryant 1982, which shown the effect in children as young as 6, because she was testing the validity of a new test of empathy called the Index of Empathy in Children and Adolescents. And she's just testing the validity, see if it could be used on the grounds that the tests that were available differed depending on the age of the person you were studying, and she wanted something that could be used for all of them. Orwest and Underson, 1998, 2,286 participants, empathy gap shown developing by age. Stoijferson, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, used Bryant's scale on Dutch adolescents, and the female adolescents showed higher same-sex empathy, whereas male adolescents showed higher other-sex empathy. Barry et al., which came out this year, or is due to come out this year, the preliminary results found that in 40 of the 30 scenarios that were tested, significantly more sympathetic towards women. But that study was also looking at other empathy gaps, not just based on sex. Rudman and Goodwin, 2004, female in-group bias is greater than men's, and it's been found that sexual history and experience actually modulates this effect, changes your view of the opposite sex, depending on how much sex you get. Eagley and Mladinic, 1994, the almost infamous women are wonderful effect, and then there's Farrell, 1993, male disposability, which we know from his book, and Demure and Pelagi, 2012, the bias in sex of trigger for yawn contagion was found in bonobos, and that's a very interesting study that I'm going to touch on slightly. So yes, Bryant 1982, an index of empathy for children and adolescents, based on Mehrabian and Epstein's 1972 measure, and was selected for 3 reasons. I've touched on one of them already. Because it defines empathy as a vicarious emotional response to the perceived emotional experiences of others. And this differs from other definitions of empathy in terms of the accuracy of cognitive social insight or social affective role-taking. And I should probably bring up the rest of my notes. There we go. The test can be administered with ease because it's just a simple pencil and paper test. And there was, as I mentioned earlier, the need for comparable forms of an empathy index for use with children, adolescents, and adults. And the measure was found to be valid, but that is slightly outside the remit of today's discussion. So this study presented the development and validation of the index and used 56 first graders, 115 fourth graders, and 87 seventh graders, and I've included the ages in brackets because being non-American, I didn't understand the grade system. 126 males, 132 females, so fairly sizable number of participants, and they're all in schools and presented with the test. And the way the test was done, the children were presented with 22 scenarios that was essentially dumbed down for kids, because you can't expect kids to be able to empathize with complex adult situations. So things such as, I'm in the playground and I see a girl who's crying. And then on a 9-point Likert scale, they asked, how much would you empathize with the girl who's crying, or how much wouldn't you? How much do you care? And so after said test, if I bring up that. So those are the questions, the scenarios that they were asked to respond to. And, well, there's the graph that shows the levels of empathy that they exhibited. And you'll probably notice in the center that massive dip at 4th grade. That did catch the authors by surprise, but it's quite simply the fact that it's called the cootie effect, which I think is quite funny. Like, ew, I don't want to touch you, you're going to give me boy germs or girl germs, that sort of thing. But I found it interesting how female-to-female empathy was unaffected. It just sailed right on over like as if nothing was happening. The female-to-male and male-to-female both recover from the cootie effect, but post-cootie effect, male-to-male empathy doesn't actually improve, it gets worse. Good-o. And this had actually been hypothesized beforehand by Feshbach and Rowe in 1968, suggesting that sex of stimulus would play a part in empathy, and later, using their Feshbach and Rowe effective situations test for empathy, found that 6 to 7-year-old boys were more empathic with boys than with girls, whereas the converse was true of girls. And then Bryant's study here expanded further on that effect. Let's skip on over to the next one. So this one is R.S. and Anderson, 1998, The Importance of Sex of Stimulus Object, Age Trends and Sex Differences in Empathic Responsiveness. I love the titles of these studies. So the primary aim of this study was to examine sex differences and age trends in self-reported empathic responsiveness, considering empathic concern, empathic distress, and a more general empathic responsiveness dimension. And so yeah, that was 2,286 participants, age range of about 13 to 16, fairly split down the middle in terms of gender, and the students were asked questionnaires in the classroom as part of a wider anti-bullying campaign or program, but included in it was a scale system similar to Bryant's 1982, about scenarios whether it applies or does not apply at all. And so the elements they were testing was for empathic distress, which is often seen as being related to the individual's own negative arousal and feelings of distress and anxiety, and 4 items in the questionnaire measured this, and empathic responsiveness was calculated using all 12 items. And I'm choosing to ignore the results of the second questionnaire about bullying for the sake of time and relevance. And so because of the fact that the study was done in 85, I had to redraw the graph. But as we can see, the girl-to-girl empathic responsiveness is highest, and then it goes girl-to-boy, which ascends, boy-to-girl, which also ascends, and then boy-to-boy, which from grades 6, 7, 8 to 9 descends continuously. And it is worth emphasizing emphasizing that the basic trend pattern identified for the two scales was also found for each of the individual items making up the scales. So that's uplifting to see. Wow. So Stoij et al. 2016, Gender Differences in Empathic Sadness Towards Persons of the Same versus Other Sex During Adolescence. And again, highly likely I mispronounced that name. Again, based on Bryant's 1982 IECA cross-sectional study, 730 participants, males 420, nice. Females 310, yeah, that was an internet reference there. And then they did a longitudinal study of 318 participants, 154 males and 164 females. In both studies, female adolescents reported more empathic sadness than did male adolescents. Female targets also received more effective empathy than did male targets, and more importantly, gender differences were observed in same-sex versus other-sex effective empathy. Basically, I'm repeating myself, it's the same thing as the other two studies, and there is the graph again, showing the exact same thing as we're expecting. Female to female is the highest, then followed by female to male, then male to female, and then male to male right at the bottom, which is upsetting. Oh, and by the way, all of these effects for the studies are found to be statistically significant for those who are sticklers for data. And so when I put all the studies, oh, and so that's the longitudinal study as well, afterwards. And the time differences between when they did the test was 1 year, and the age of the participants for this one was 13 to 16. So my apologies. And so these are the results over time. So Bryant's study in 1982, the Orris and Anderson in 1998, and the Stoij in 2016, showing near similar results over the past, 3.5 decades. Worrying stuff indeed. And we see that the empathy gap is greater with men, or with boys, than it is with females, which I find to be odd. Very odd, and I think more research needs to be done into why that gap is in some cases 4 to 5 times the size as the female gap. So I wanted to show just some manifestations of the empathy gap and just general male sacrifice in effect. How that young boy dives on his little sister to save her from the hosepipe. That's not going to touch her anyway because of the glass door, but instinctively he's down. But the story on the left, I remember... He's oppressing her, that's what it is. It's concern oppression. But the story on the left by the doctor really did touch home with me when I first saw on Instagram. I'll just read it out for those at the back who can't see it. It says, "Today I operated on a little girl. She needed O blood. We didn't have any, but her twin brother has O blood. I explained to him that it was a matter of life and death. He sat quietly for a moment and then said goodbye to his parents. I didn't think anything of it until after we took his blood, and he asked, 'So when will I die?' He thought he was giving his life for hers. Thankfully, they'll both be fine, because it's just a bit of blood. But if memory serves, when I looked into the story, the twins were 4 years old. And so at the age 4, that young boy was willing, in his mind, to give his life to save his sisters. So if time allows, I'm going to touch on the yawn contagion. I don't know how long I've been talking for. Am I good? Safe. So, yawn contagion. This I find fascinating, this study. Absolutely. 1 minute? Okay. Oh, okay. Okay, so, yawn contagion. This is an incredibly interesting, as I've just said a moment ago, effect. Because as we all know about yawn contagion, it's a right bastard. That if you see someone yawn, you want to yawn. If you hear a yawn, you want to yawn. Even reading about yawns makes you want to yawn. And so, when I was reading this study, and a related study I've not included, but when I was reading these studies, yawn was like every other word. I was struggling to breathe. I was practically hyperventilating just reading these studies. Yeah, so, Demuro and Pelagi, 2012. About 50% of human subjects yawn within a few minutes after watching a video of a yawning person. Since most yawn events occur in social context, it has been hypothesized that the infectiousness of yawning may be linked to emotional arousal. Some recent studies suggest that yawn contagion is based on a similar mechanism to empathy, and thus could reflect a basic form of empathy, which can be tentatively defined as the capacity to catch and feel in an unconscious and automatic... Are you going off? Are you? Careful, you'll set me off. Where was I? Which can be tentatively defined as the capacity to catch and feel in an unconscious and automatic way an emotional state expressed by another individual. Linkage between yawn contagion and empathy in humans is supported by clinical, psychological, neurobiological, and ethological clues. Subjects suffering from empathy-related disorders such as autism or schizophrenia show lower levels of yawn contagion, whereas subjects obtaining higher scores in questionnaires evaluating empathy and mental state attribution show higher rates of yawn contagion. Contagious yawning activates the posterior cingulate, the inferior frontal gyrus, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and... Hello? Brain parts. Another neuron, mirror neuron errors. I was just saying, for anyone in here who's a neurobiologist just trying to show off my cred, that's what it really is. But all these areas I mentioned are areas known to be part of empathy networks and processes. So it's quite interesting that on a neurological level, that the yawn contagion, of which we're assuming to be related to empathy, is a neurological thing. So all the evidence is still up for debate. Mirror neurons can be recruited for yawn contagion, and mirror neurons are what goes on in your brain when you're thinking about the actions of others and how you replicate them yourself, and is also involved in learning. So yeah, with the yawning bonobos, suffers from a small sample size, unfortunately, but they had a load of bonobos just living in a zoo, and they were selected as bonobos are similar to humans in terms of behavior. And behavioral data were collected during 3 months of observation on a group of them housed in a primate park in the Netherlands. During the collection, the colony was composed of 12 individuals, 2 adult males, 6 adult females, and 4 immature subjects. So yes, a very small sample. Daily observations covered a 6-hour period encompassing both morning and afternoon. As this was part of a long-term project, a wide array of data regarding various social behaviours and context was collected according to a blind coding protocol in which the observers were not aware of the hypotheses and predictions that would have been tested. Social hierarchy, kinship, familial relations, social tension contexts, such as social tension versus relaxation, disturbance from feeding, visitation from staff, etc., all of that was controlled for. And this was to examine the effects of different variables on the frequency of yawn contagion. A linear mixed model was run. The dependent scale variable was the relative frequency of yawn contagion by the responder, measured as the number of times such responder had yawned after a given triggering subject's yawn, normalized on the number of occasions, minimum 6. Whew. Breathe after that super long sentence. And I just wanted to briefly touch on how not only do other species exhibit the empathy gap, but it is seriously old. Original divergence between genus Pan and Homo may have occurred as nearly as 13 million years ago in the Miocene period. Hybridization may have been ongoing until as recent as 4 million years ago in the Pliocene. And they did repeat this study with humans. Unfortunately, were unable to find statistically significant impact or interaction on sex of yawner and sex of responder. However, it is hypothesized that in correct circumstances you could probably find it. And so here is the graphs. Unfortunately, they're not very easy to look at, but to quote from the study, our finding on a non-human ape, the bonobo, supports the idea that the link between yawn contagion and a basic form of empathy is not due to evolutionary convergence, but is instead a common ancestral trait shared by monkeys and apes, including humans. The higher frequency of yawn contagion between individuals belonging to different genders, figure 4a, and in presence of a female as a triggering subject, suggests that bonobo males are more effectively reactive towards females, who constitute the core of social groups. Masson and co-workers recently demonstrated that in chimpanzees, male yawns were far more contagious than those of females. In addition, individuals of the dominant and bonded sex, i.e. males in pan troglodytes, infected each other at the highest levels. Even though our findings have to be taken with caution due to the small sample size of adult males, in bonobos, yawn contagion appears to support the hypothesis that adult females not only represent the relational and decisional nucleus of the society, but also that they play a key role in affecting the emotional state of others. So these results suggest that yawn contagion is modulated by kinship and social hierarchy, which is why yawn contagion is higher when you're around people you're friendly with. and also why it's higher when the female is the stimulus in bonobos, but higher for male in chimpanzees because of the hierarchical structures. In fact, going further on from yawn contagion, it has been found that distal proximity has less of an effect than emotional proximity, such that I could yawn right now, and people in the front row who've only just met me today wouldn't yawn. However, I could have someone who I'm really close to at the back, and they will yawn because of emotional connection, which is why the impact of social structures has such an influence, because it denotes how much power they got. And that, I think, is that for the end of my speech, so thank you.